Woman, Chapter 6. There they were, the two familiar figures sitting facing each other among the stones of the great cedars on the hilltop. Lucy and Hogarth had told them the things were, and how everybody was getting worse by the minute, how people would soon be starving to death. But the great eyes in the great faces stared down at them without moving. Then the Iron Woman's voice rumbled through them. They still haven't learned, it said. The women will have to learn and change. They really have, cried Lucy. People are in a terrible state. I shall know when they have changed, said the Iron Woman. Something will happen. A certain thing will happen. What? Cried Hogarth. How shall we know what it is? You'll see, said the Iron Woman. Or maybe I should say, you will hear. What does she mean? And at that very moment the Iron Man raised his huge finger. There it is now. Lucy and Hogarth listened. At first they could hear nothing. Then, without hearing anything in particular, they were hearing something, like a shuddering in the air. The Iron Woman got to her feet. The Iron Man stood beside her. The two of them stood very still, gazing out over the landscape, listening. Isn't it the sea? Hogarth could hear it now, like a slight groan, a groan followed by a groan, followed by a groan, each time louder. It was as if something was coming towards them across the country, groaning as it came. Whatever it was, thought Hogarth, it must be vast, almost like the sea. The Iron Woman raised her right hand and pointed. A low, webby cloud, almost like a dark mist, had spread over the land. Were they the groans coming out of the cloud mist? As they watched, the cloud seemed to be growing, thickening, bulging into lumps like a sea of porridge. At the same time, it was like nets tangling and untangling. It covered the town and the marsh. It heaped nearer, all the time the groans, like some weary creature groaning with every breath, grew louder and nearer. They did not see, they could not see, what was happening beneath the cloud. Lucy's mother had just had a new shock. Every 2 hours or so she would go to the bathroom to have a few words with her husband. Not that he ever answered. There he lay, very black, along the bottom of the bath, perfectly still, until she tapped the bath's edge. Then he seemed to wake up. With a slow half wiggle he would lift himself off the bottom, with his bulging eyes would break the surface. Then he would lie, half floating, his orange chin on the bath's edge, gazing at her while she tried to cheer him up. It was hard for her, looking at those cold, round, gold-ringed eyes, to think this was Charles, her husband. This time, when she opened the door, a gloomy fog billowed out of her face. It wasn't smoke, or at least it had no smell. It was strangely clinging fog, like drifting webs. She brushed it from her face, and her hand seemed to be draped with it for a moment, a peculiar clinging gloom at the dark of the smoke of her burning eyes. So she could not see the opposite wall of the bathroom. It flowed out round her, past her into the house. Then she saw that it was rising in puffs from the bath like a smoke signal. And now she saw the bubbles wobbling from her mouth in a giant newt, or from her husband's mouth rather, where he lay, a jagged shape against the white porcelain, resting lightly on his spread rubbery fingers. She tapped the bath, but he ignored her. About every 3 seconds another fat bubble wobbled up and burst in a dark puff, like a soft, silent shell burst of those weird, untangling fibres of gloom. She rolled back her sleeve, plunging her hand into the water, and rocked him gently, but he still ignored her, only letting out 3 big bubbles. Was he ill? Were these bubbles the beginning of the end? Charles! She called. Charles! Then she almost screamed it. Charles! She lifted him to the surface. It wasn't difficult in the water. Before this she'd always been afraid to touch this bright orange, black speckled underside, because it might be poisonous. But she gave no thought to that now. She had drew his chin over the bath's edge. He rested there, his eyes fixed glassily. Another bubble swelled slowly from his lips, till it popped like a tangle puff of gloom. Then with a wiggle he backed off and sank to the bottom. Another bubble came up. Whatever was going on, he seemed to be concentrating on his bubbles. She ran through the bedrooms, which were now dense with a strange gloom, and opened the windows. She saw Mrs. Wilde, her neighbour across the street, doing the same thing, with the gloom billowing out around them from the opened windows. Mr. Wilde was an enormous freshwater shrimp, and he was in the bath too. Is he bubbling? She called. Charles is bubbling, these funny dark bubbles. What's next? Cried Mrs. Wilde. I think I'm going mad. In every home it was the same, and in the swimming pools, the water tanks, the ponds, wherever the changed men were, they were burping these bubbles, and all over the land that dark, ropey, webby fog was rising from their mouths and these dumb creatures, like tangling smokes from countless little campfires. It rose, forming the dark cloud, that eerie, gloomy cloud, which more and more looked like a vast net draped over the land. All day the cloud went on thickening, while the Iron Woman and Iron Man watched. In the end, Lucy and Hogarth had to go home beneath it, still hearing the strange sighing groan, which seemed to come from everywhere. They sat for a long time in the bathroom, watching her father's bubbles. Next morning the house was a clear Next morning the house was clear of the gloom. Lucy's father lay with his chin on the bath's edge, waiting to be fed. His bubbling had stopped, and the groaning too outside had stopped. But the sky was dark, for for a heavy thunderstorm. A dense, black, bluish, webby cloud lay over everything. The air was still. Not a bird moved. Once again Lucy and Hogarth climbed through the woods and came out of the cloud. The two giant figures stood as they had last seen them. "What's happening?" cried Lucy as she came nearer. "What's that funny cloud?" But now they both saw the eyes of the Iron Woman and Iron Man were beaming red. Four powerful red rays of red light, like laser beams, plunged down into the dark cloud spread out below. "Something's going on," whispered Hogarth. They heard a cry, a sob. It was so loud and vast of the groans yesterday, but now a sob. And as Lucy and Hogarth watched, they saw a bulge lumping out of the middle of the cloud over the town. The bulge grew rounder as something was pushing an immense head up through it. There they saw it had eyes. The eyes were so big that it was not easily to see that they were eyes at all, but they were more than two. But now they had seen them, and there was no mistaking them. Vast, mournful eyes, two huge ones, but then on either side of them a smaller one, and two more, slightly smaller again, on either side of these four. Then two more, smaller again. Eight in all, or was it 10? And a mouth, a great cloudy cave of a gaping mouth, slowly open as if it took a long breath. Then came another sob. The cloud seemed to be one gigantic head, a shapeless, ragged sort of head, like a jellyfish, or like an octopus spreading out over the vast knotted tangle of cloudy legs covering the entire landscape, or like an immense hairy spider whose legs came out even more immense web that lay over the land. As they watched, the mouth opened wider. The cloud was now sobbing like a giant baby with wide opened mouth, that mouth that opened wider and wider, squeezing the eyes shut. The four strong red beams from the eyes of the two giants plunged into the darkness of the gaping toad-like mouth of that giant spider cloud. The sobs were now incredibly loud, like Spider-Face had come closer. It seemed to be resting its chin on the tree tops of the woods below. Its rows of eyes opened again and gazed woefully down at the two giants that they'd heard. "Release me!" The the words were like the cloud. They filled the whole landscape. Yet they were blurred, smoky somehow, and as if the whole spreading web were like some kind of aerial transmitting the sounds. The Iron Woman's voice seemed normal, familiar in comparison, yet it was like thunder. "First," she said, "confess who you are." The spider cloud was silent for a while. It seemed surprised. It stared down at the two giants who stared up at them, their crimson beams. "Confess!" roared the Iron Man, crashing all the gears of his voice. "Tell us who you are!" thundered the Iron Woman. The spider cloud seemed to rear up. Its eyes bulged. Then it bellowed, "I am the spider god of wealth. Wealth! Wealth! The spider god of more and more and more and more money. I catch it in my web." It gazed furiously down and shook the vast web, but the four red laser beams blazed into its eyes, and it blinked. It screwed up its eyes in its mouth. "Now tell us who you really are," thundered the Iron Woman. The goblinish cloud snapped its wide, flat mouth. It seemed to bristle and glow even darker. Its eyes crowded them close together, and sheet lightnings flashed in them. "I am the spider god of grain, the spider god of winning at all costs. I will catch the prize in my net." And it reared up to a great height and let out a tremendous laugh, shaking its web like a cloak the size of the country. The thing that had been groaning and painfully and sobbing so pitifully was laughing. "Now you've got your lies," thundered the Iron Woman. "Confess who you really are." Both Lucy and Hogarth dropped to the ground. It sounded as though the world had exploded. The vast shape seemed to rear even higher, and at the same time to pounce down. To his amazement, Hogarth saw a long, bluish tongue flashed out of the spider cloud's mouth, lashed around the Iron Man like a whip, and vanished back into his mouth, taking the Iron Woman with it. "Iron Man!" grunted Hogarth, as if he could help. and the next minute the long tongue came flashing out again, empty, and whipped itself this time tightly round the Iron Woman. "Oh no!" screamed Lucy. "Oh no!" And sure enough, the tongue stopped there, sticking rigidly out full length. It writhed, trying to free itself from the Iron Woman. The cloudy mouth gaped with the squirming lips. Their eyes seemed to be climbing down over the great up lip to come to help out the tongue, for the tongue was in trouble. It could not free itself from the Iron Woman. Her fingers were buried into it like dreadful pincers. The tongue tried to pull itself through the tightly closed lips to force her off the end of it, but she was actually climbing up it, hand over hand, dragging the tongue further out between the lips as she clawed her way up. Ah! A miserable wail clung out, echoing off the far corners of the sky, and the spider cloud reared up, twisting like a whale coming out of the sea, and crashed down again. It reared again and crashed again. The mouth gaped till the eyes popped like blebs of a tyre, and the thing tried to retch. The tongue stuck out, failing this way and that. Lucy and Hogarth watched aghast. They could see the Iron Woman was now more than halfway up the tongue, climbing slowly towards the tonsils, deep inside the black gape of the mouth, which now stretched so wide it seemed to be turning itself inside out. The sounds of retching were now like incessant thunder, as a giant dark shape flopped about the landscape. They glimpsed the Iron Woman forcing her way over the root of the tongue into the cavern of the throat. Suddenly the mouth closed, and the spider cloud slumped over the town, silent and motionless. Lucy and Hogarth stood up. Their faces were white. Their hair stuck out in all directions as if they'd been rescued from an explosion. Neither of them could speak. It really did look as though the Iron Woman and the Iron Man had gone. But now the cloud was shuddering, and they heard again, just as before, sobbing. Then the Iron Woman's voice, muffled and echoey, came out of the depth of the cloud. "Confess who you are! Confess! Confess!" With each word came a thud that shook the hill under their feet, and at each thud a strange going boom, like a girder falling from the hull of a ship, and at each boom the cloud spider jumped and shook like a bag with an animal inside it. "It's the Iron Woman doing her dance," cried Lucy. "Listen, inside there." "And that's the Iron Man," cried Hogarth, beating his chest for a drum, keeping time. The cloud spider's lips were opening wider, blubbery and squirming. Big tears rolled out between the tightly closed eyelids, rolled down in a splash through the town. "Mess," wailed the great face. "Mess." "Who are you?" thundered the Iron Woman from deep inside. "Say it again." And her pounding dance step shook the hill in time to her words, while the cloud spider jerked and contorted like a rubber comedian's face. "I am a mess! I am a mess!" came the sobbing wail. "And who will clean you up?" came the Iron Woman's voice, her words timed with the stamping dance steps and the weird wanging boom that shook the hill. "Who will you clean up? Who? Who?" "Mother!" wailed the vast snake of a mouth. "Who? Mother! Who? Mother! Tell us again. Who? Mother will clean me up." But now the cloud spider was beginning to turn as if the dancing woman had begun to turn inside it, dragging it with her like a gown. Its wail grew, agonized, higher, thinner. Its edges were being dragged towards the turning centre, like spaghetti being rolled up on a fork. As it turned, it rose upwards, turning faster. Soon it was spinning like an immense whirlpool. The Iron Woman's revolving dance had turned into something else, something that climbed into a spinning column. The cloudy body and webs of a giant spider were twisting tightly around it. "It's the space-bat dragon, angel dragon," cried Hogarth. "Going back up, it's taking the horrible cloud with it." "What about the Iron Woman?" cried Lucy. Sure enough, the long, swaying, whirling corkscrew of darkness was going up, just as they'd seen the space-bat angel dragon coming down. Lucy and Hogarth couldn't take their eyes off it. The cloud spider was now completely wrapped around the spinning column in its tight, webby folds, with a few raggy squirms of it flinging out here and there. Somewhere in there, in the 8 eyes, must be stretched out long and flat, like elastic. But where would the Iron Woman and Iron Man? They watched the writhing column climb into the sky with its corkscrew tip now piercing upwards, worming upwards, huge and dark and towering. It swayed as it climbed, growing smaller as it climbed away. Soon it was a wispy bolt, high in the blue, then a dithering dot, like a starlight. They watched it and watched it, till at last they were staring into nothing. They looked down the hill. The air was so clear in the morning sun. The town seemed to be sparkling. The Iron Woman and Iron Man were just coming out of the woods, climbing towards them. Lucy ran towards them and stopped. Hogarth joined her. The two giants stopped. Oh, cried Lucy, are you all right? The Iron Woman was no longer beautiful, gleaming black. She was the colour of an iron fire grate with many fires, rusting pink and blue-grey. And the Iron Man was the same, as if the inside of the cloud spider had been a furnace of some kind. Go home now, said the Iron Woman, and watch. Watch and wait. The Iron Man said nothing, just raised his giant hand. Like everybody else, Lucy's mother had heard and watched the tremendous storm of happenings in the dark cloud, and, she too had watched a spinning blur climb away into nothing, as if the whole terrific tempest had drained into the blue sky through an upward plug hole. She was still standing at the window in a daze when a voice behind her complained, "Towels! Where are the towels?" She turned. There was her husband, stark naked except for a skimpy hand towel, shivering and goose pimpled from head to foot, with a 7-day beard, his hair plastered over his brow. But worst of all, the stubby beard and the hair that should have been black and curly were now snow white. "Charlie!" she screamed, fainted. So it all seemed to be over. All the men climbed out of the rivers, the ponds, and the swimming pools, the baths. Women ran everywhere with bags of clothes and towels. Slowly, life started up. Lights came on. Cars began to move. Shops opened. Telephones rang incessantly. But things had changed. For one thing, it was not only Lucy's father whose hair had gone white. Every man who'd been a fish, or a seal, or a water bug, leech had had white hair. Men who'd been grizzled or nearly grey, stared into their mirrors at their silvery white hair and called, "Oh, goodness, I look like Granny!" Or else, "But my face isn't any older, is it?" And young men whose hair had been curly gold or glossy auburn brown or mousy hardly dared catch the sight of themselves in the cat mirror or in the shop window. "It's no wonder," they said to their girls or boyfriend. "What we went through was no joke. Worse than seeing 1,000 ghosts. You would have gone white too." Within days, hairdressers and chemists were running out of hair dye. But other things had changed for the better. Everybody realised straight away that terrible scream and no longer blasted them had touched each other. Instead, they now all heard all the time, but only faintly, like ringing in the ears, and strangely enough, it came and went. It was easy to see what made it come, and when you looked at the waste bin, it came noticeably stronger. And when you poured soap powder into a washing machine, it seemed to zoom in you and go past very close like a jet over the house. But a jet powered with those screams, it was a bit of a shock. And then Mr. Wells, with his little white moustache, looked at the stacking drums of toxic waste. It came nearly full strength, a painful screech in his ear, and something coming straight out of him. He had to look away quickly. So nobody would forget. Farmers stood in their fields listening and thinking. Factory owners sat in their offices listening and thinking. The Prime Minister sat with his cabinet ministers listening and thinking. And whoever spoke, the others looked at the speaker's weirdly white hair and listened more carefully, and thought more deeply. They had all learned a frightening lesson, but what could they do about it? They soon found out. Early next morning, an odd thing was noticed. The first men back to work at Chicago saw a yellow net, like a massive spider's web, draped thickly over the stacks of drums of poisonous chemicals. Each strand was the thickness of a pencil, and no brittle, so it broke up the short length. It was a mystery. The same webs were draped over all the waste dumps in the country, over all the rubbish heaps, over all the lagoons of cattle slurry. Chemists were baffled by it, and they tried to find out what it was. But pretty soon they found out what it was good for. It was for the perfect fuel. Dissolve it in water, and it would do everything that oil and petrol would do, yet fish could live in it. It would burn in a fireplace with a giant flame, but no fumes of any kind. And that first morning there were thousands of tons of it. Next morning the same. Now everybody could see the rubbish and the poisonous waste were being mysteriously changed into these yellow webs during the night. Even if you had a rubbish heap in your back garden, you could have a web in the next morning, or a web where it'd been. Then you could dissolve it in the water and run your car on it for a while. Strange. People soon realised what was happening. At nightfall, a mist gathered over the rubbish. Wherever it might be, a dark, webbery, smoky mist, just like the clouds of puff that had bubbled over those suffering men when they were fish and newts and frogs. And the next morning there was a yellow web, and the rubbish was gone, or most of it had. Another night and it would be gone, as if the mist had eaten the rubbish and left a web. No wonder they called it a miracle. It happened in no other country. But whether the rubbish or the waste leaked into the stream or pond, the mist would not form. Once that leak was stopped, Sure enough, the next night the webs would come. So everybody stopped those leaks because everybody wanted the magic fuel. Mr. Webbs didn't have to scratch his bald head for long. He blocked up all those outlets into the river and simply stacked the waste, where it would soon turn into yellow webs. Then each day his men harvested the yellow webs. Now he could import waste from all over the world, the more the better. All his suppliers had to pay him to take it, of course. Then he sold the yellow webs. Soon he would triple all his wages. And soon, too, they found it was better than manure, or treated this way. It would kill the Colorado beetles and nothing else. Treated that way, it would keep out thistles. It could be made to do anything. Of course, nobody knew what really happened. A miracle, they said, shaking their heads. Truly. Our problem, said the Prime Minister, seemed to be strangely solved. Hogarth had to go home. On the last morning, he and Lucy climbed the hill together. It was the third day of the webs. Everybody was still baffled by these strange, brittle, yellowy nets. Lucy and Hogarth were no wiser than anybody else. But they knew that it had to do with the terrible fight the Iron Woman had clawed her way down the cloud spider's throat and fought it from inside with her dreadful dance and the star power of the space bat angel dragon. Something to do with the way the space bat angel dragon had whirled it into a spinning blur and taken it upwards. There were the Iron Woman and Iron Man sitting on the hilltop. Among the cedars, the Iron Man had brought up the birdwatcher's car out of the marsh. He was folding pieces of it into handy shapes. They seemed to be having a picnic together. Every trace of their scorching and the burns had disappeared. In fact, they both seemed brighter than ever. The Iron Woman's blue-black looked new-made. Lucy wondered if they'd been polishing each other. She and Hogarth sat on the grass nearby, gazing at them. Iron Man, can I ask you something? Said Hogarth after a while. The Iron Man swiveled his head slightly and stopped chewing to show he was listening. Where are the yellow webs from? He asked. The Iron Man started to chew again. He seemed to be looking at the Iron Woman. Minutes passed. Finally, the Iron Woman spoke. Where from? She said, and paused. She went on chewing for a while. She was bent over something in her lap, and she worked it carefully. Then her voice came again, rumbling somehow from beneath them, or echoing somehow from above them. Where? She asked. Did the space cloud spider come from? Bubbles! Cried Lucy. How had she forgot those bubbles? The Iron Woman chewed. She seemed not heard, as she worked at whatever was in her lap. Then her voice came again. And the bubbles? Where did the bubbles come from? Both Lucy and Hogarth were thinking the same thing. Obviously the bubbles had come from, well, from inside Lucy's father, for one, when he was a giant newt, and from inside Hogarth's father, when he was a giant frog, and from all the men. Lucy frowned. Was the Iron Woman saying that the yellow webs, or whatever was making the yellow webs, was the same thing that made the bubbles, inside her father and inside the others somehow? How could that be? But the Iron Woman's voice was rumbling again. Big, deep fright, she said. Big, deep change. Lucy thought about her father's hair. That was big change, all right, but still, it was only his hair. Whatever had made those bubbles, that's where the change must be. That was deep. But what was it, and how could it be? Lucy and Hogarth were lost in their thoughts as they gazed up at the huge, mysterious faces. The Iron Woman reached out and laid over Lucy's shoulders a heavy, cool necklace made of flowers from every month in the year. Later, Lucy counted them. There were 52 different kinds of flowers. The giant hand came out again and laid another flower necklace exactly the same over Hogarth's shoulders. Then she lifted both her hands and laid another necklace, very much bigger, very thick and heavy, made entirely of foxgloves, round the neck of the Iron Man. Finally, she put one over her own head and arranged it across her chest. This one, Lucy saw, was made entirely of snowdrops. The four of them sat there in the warm morning sun, not saying anything. Lucy and Hogarth simply watched the huge faces of their strange friends and listened to the faint sound in their ears. This sound, they now noticed, seemed to have become stronger and different. It was not a faint sound of the creatures crying. It was music of a kind, from far, far up. They both looked up into the blue, gazing and listening. It was not a skylark. That is the end of The Iron Woman. I hope you enjoyed.